Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. As an antidote to the creeping cynicism about our current political world, Corinna Gore Schiff has written a book called Lighting the Way. In it, she tells how 9 extraordinary women use their political skills to achieve remarkable progress in their quest for equality and social justice. And implicitly, she exhorts us to similar action. Actually, you really say that they use more than political skills. They have a passion and a drive, right? It's
true. I think that all 9 of these women had an extraordinary ability to sort of be ahead of their time on certain issues that we look back on as being major moral moments for the country, whether it was civil rights or equal rights, certain public health challenges. And they really had the ability to light the way in the direction for others to make positive changes.
When I said that you did this book to prevent yourself from becoming too cynical about politics, that's because the book was written shortly after the 2000 election, or you started the work on it?
Well, it was written not too long after the 2000 election, and I grew up around politics in a very political family. And I, more often than not, had a sort of privileged vantage point on the process, the rallies, the debates, the campaign trail, and election nights.
You're always on the platform.
Right, but I really did love that vantage point, and in 2000 I participated actively in the campaign, and in the aftermath I was very disappointed, and not just about the outcome, certainly that, but also just reflecting on the tenor of the debate and the disengagement of so many people from the political process. And I was drawn to the cynicism that I think is so pervasive in our society, but I really wanted to fight it and reconnect to what I loved about politics, what I'd always loved, which was not the spin and the superficiality and who's ahead in the horse race at the moment, but really the essence of public service, how laws and policies affect individuals' lives and how our social fabric can be made stronger and better by real leadership.
And how, right, the leadership, how you get to do that. That's what I thought. I mean, I think all the women saw that they needed to have regulations or laws, and they led the way to force the political leaders, I mean, the traditional office holders to write them or do them. Right?
It's true, and for me, their stories were very therapeutic in a way, because it did remind me of the uplifting and accessible aspects of politics. And none of these women were elected officials, and none really had extraordinary power. I suppose Frances Perkins is one who eventually achieved that, but none of them started with it, and yet they made major changes for the better in our political system.
But they made their own power.
Absolutely.
They did it in a different way.
In a different way, and I think in a way because
a wonderful way.
A wonderful way, and I think because they were women and not considered for the more conventional roles of authority, it made them even more innovative in finding, for instance...
Well, let's go through. Who are the women?
All right. It begins with Ida B. Wells Barnett. She hyphenated her name when she got married. She was born a slave 6 months before the Emancipation Proclamation, and was a teacher early on, and a journalist, a great truth-telling journalist. And she brought one of the first legal challenges to segregation in 1883.
Which was astonishing, because we've heard really nothing about that.
It's true, and she refused to give up her seat on a train car, was forcibly removed, brought legal action, ultimately not successful, obviously. But she went on to expose lynching and the lies that justified lynching in the South. She fought segregation and racism in every form, but her real legacy was in exposing lynching. And she traveled around the country and also in Europe. And as one contemporary put it, you shook this country like an earthquake. And she really did make a big difference in the awareness of that horrible crime.
How did she go from being a slave to doing this and having the money? That was what I was interested in. How did that happen?
Well, she was a great believer in education. I think that she would have made a wonderful lawyer, a wonderful judge, any number of professions. She had a very sharp mind, analytical mind, and she read. She was part of a culture in Memphis early on, and then later in Chicago. Actually, her life was threatened in Memphis, and her newspaper, The Free Speech, was burned down, and so she ended up leaving and settling in Chicago. But she read extensively. She joined all kinds of debate nightclubs, and in the kind of black culture of both of those cities, she was very much a leader, and she started what are still in effect in some cities of Ida B. Wells clubs to do the same. So she really believed that knowledge was power. She taught herself the law as much as possible, and pursued legal action in various segregation cases. She also found allies. She was a great friend of Susan B. Anthony, of Frederick Douglass. She worked with W.B. Du Bois, and so she, in her day, was just a truly extraordinary intellect and force.
She has more stories, but we won't tell them all, so you can read the book. But then then the next one?
Mother Jones. And Mother Jones, in a way, the most radical woman in my book, and sort of over the top at times, someone who I don't agree with on everything, but a really fascinating, colorful character. She came over as Mary Harris from Ireland during the potato famine, settled in Memphis, and married George Jones, and they had 4 children. A terrible thing happened. There was a yellow fever epidemic, and it killed all 4 of her children and her husband. And she very much, I think, internalized the social context of this devastating personal loss. At the time, when yellow fever would strike, and it did every few years in the South in these days, everyone who could leave a stricken area did, and those who remained were mainly the powerless, poor whites and blacks. She picked herself up. She got a permit to nurse the sufferers. She then picked herself up later in her, not famous until her 60s, but she became a very fiery labor leader, organizing coal miners at first.
How did she get into coal mines? That's what I didn't.
How did she focus on that? She first came to public notice when there was an army led by a man named Jacob Coxey, not a real army, but this was during a time of terrible unemployment, and he was leading unemployed people who were finding it impossible to get work, and they were carrying banners and saying, "We want jobs, we need jobs," and the message that the government should actively create jobs was sort of unprecedented. But she very much bought into this, and then after she had, she first appeared as Mother Jones in the newspaper as part of this group, really raising that issue. And then she ended up meeting coal miners through that, and when she went into the mines and she saw so many immigrants actually working, and I think she very much identified with immigrants as an Irish immigrant herself, and she cultivated this persona as a sort of little old lady. She had a black long dress and a lace collar here and a pancake hat. With her white hair swept up in a bun. And she really had, I think, this rapport with the miners. She would go down and sort of have a glass of whiskey with the miners and talk to them at a time when they were working in company towns. Really no semblance of democracy. The mine guards were the local police force. They were paid in scrip, which could only be cashed in at the company store. They had to buy their own water and pickaxes, and often had wages unjustly withheld. So she had a great deal of success in organizing them, and in fact ended up being court-martialed, called the most dangerous woman in America, banned from Colorado for a time where she had been organizing, and then settled eventually on child labor as her main cause. And this was a time where it wasn't unusual for 8-year-olds to go for a lifetime of work in mills, mines, and factories. And she used her own persona and the power of public awareness to really embarrass those who were profiting from.
She had a real dramatic flair also.
A real dramatic flair,
so
sometimes too dramatic in terms of she did have a tendency to exaggerate.
Yeah.
She did make things up on occasion, and I did try in all of these chapters to honestly paint weaknesses and flaws as well as strengths of these women. I think with Mother Jones, she's a case where her flaw was a bit more pronounced in that regard, but you have to look at her story where she was a poor immigrant, elderly widow who ended up commanding the front pages of national papers, and in doing so changed the debate on child labor, which was a huge accomplishment.
I want to go through all these, but I don't want to just have that be the program. So let's make them briefer. Now, what was the next one?
Okay, Alice Hamilton, a doctor who was a pioneer in industrial medicine.
Remarkable woman, too.
Absolutely.
First woman appointed to to Harvard.
She first woman in 1919 asked to join the Harvard faculty, and it wasn't because they wanted a woman. Actually, they made 2 stipulations.
I love those stipulations.
They said you can never participate in commencement, and you can't have any football tickets.
So crazy.
But they asked her because she was such a pioneer in her field at the height of the Industrial Revolution, with all these new chemicals and processes being used in factories and plants. She made it her mission as a physician, no small feat, as a woman in the late 19th century, she became a physician, to analyze the effects of these chemicals on the workers. Many were being poisoned at a fairly fast clip, and so she early on discovered lead poisoning, mercury poisoning, as well as picric and other things used in World War I to make weapons, and made a very big difference. Her influence really culminated in the New Deal. She was quite close to and mentored, in a way, Eleanor Roosevelt, and had a big influence on the Roosevelts.
The next person?
Frances Perkins.
Another Roosevelt-era person.
Exactly. Frances Perkins I had heard of as the first female cabinet secretary. And I'd always sort of gotten the sense that she was a token woman in some way, that FDR was courting the women's vote, that Eleanor Roosevelt was such a feminist that she'd sort of pushed her in there. And in fact, I was astonished to see how incredibly influential Frances Perkins really was, the only cabinet member to serve for FDR's entire presidency, except for one other. And someone who really had gotten her start in the Al Smith administration in New York, and was behind many of the reforms of...
And progressive social issues,
yes,
right?
Absolutely. She was, just quickly, a turning point in her life came in 1911 in New York City, when she was having tea with her friend down the street from the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And this was a sweatshop. There were hundreds of young women and girls who were working, and they were locked inside, in part to keep them working longer hours, to keep labor agitators out. And a terrible fire happened. Frances and her friend walked down the street to see the horrible result, which was that over 300 of them died, either inside or jumping out of the windows and hitting the sidewalk. And it was shocked the nation, was on the cover of papers, and Frances Perkins really saw this as galvanizing and made it her mission to take legislators face-to-face with sweatshop workers. She had them crawl through makeshift fire escapes. She really, Al Smith, who was then an assemblyman, called this the greatest education he ever had. And when he became governor, appointed her industrial commissioner. She stayed on when FDR succeeded him, and then went on to Washington and was behind such groundbreaking legislation as the Social Security Act.
Next.
Okay, Virginia Durr. Virginia Durr, real fiery persona on the vanguard of the civil rights movement, who came to it in a very interesting way. She was born in Birmingham, Alabama, and raised in a really white, racist family. Her own father was a registrar who bragged that no black person would ever get past him at the polls. She was raised on tales of the gallant Confederacy and racial inferiority and superiority, and taken to marches that featured the KKK. And she, through a series of awakenings, as well as her own very feisty, innate sense of justice, came to believe that racism was wrong. And as she put it, stepped outside the magic circle. And she explained that she came to realize that there were certain social forces, that what made her act in a racist way was not so much how she felt, but how she thought her father would think of her if she were to sit down with a black person. And she described that magic circle and said, if you step outside of it, you can start to see the world in a new way. And she explained this with poverty as well, saying that there was such horrible poverty around her growing up. She remembers children shaking with rickets, with the lack of calcium, and her parents would just say, well, they were born that way, and God has ordained this distribution of wealth, and they would waste the money if they had any. And once she realized what was really going on, she was just astonished, and she made it her mission to go with the Red Cross to convince people to distribute milk and work on nutrition.
She was close also to Eleanor Roosevelt, wasn't she?
Yeah, she was. And then and she really worked through a web of friendships and relationships, and her
knew how to use it.
Yes, absolutely. Very gregarious, sociable woman. And she really made her strongest mark in the civil rights movement fighting the poll tax. And this was, of course, an effort to disenfranchise blacks in the South. And she took it on, and really with quite acute political skill, assembled a coalition, eventually successful when one of her old friends, Lyndon B. Johnson, signed the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act of '64, and finally ended the poll tax. And he wrote her a letter saying that she was an early voice of conscience to him on that issue.
All right, now we're just going to really mention the next ones.
Septima Clark, great civil rights pioneer. She had citizenship schools around the South, and she trained the voters and leaders and activists of the civil rights movement, including Rosa Parks, who visited one of her workshops just months before she made her brave protest that changed history.
Next was
Dolores Huerta. Dolores Huerta was first a teacher in California and was teaching the children of migrant farm workers largely, and realizing that they were hungry, didn't have enough clothing, were called to help their parents, and began to organize their the migrant farm workers. Along with Cesar Chavez, started the United Farm Workers, and they won for them everything from clean water, what she called motherhood type things, toilets available in the fields, to the first health and pension plan, the right to collective bargaining. She's still alive, and some protection from really harmful pesticides. Right. She's still alive and working today, but I focused a bit more on the 60s. Yeah. And Helen Rodriguez-Trias.
We're never going to get through this one and have something else to talk about. Go on, because they're all such fascinating stories.
I know. I'll be quick. Helen Rodriguez-Trias, physician, real pioneer in public health, particularly women's health. She fought the coerced sterilization that went on largely in communities of color and Native American, Black, and Hispanic communities. She exposed this and fought it, and really fought for women's health.
And then finally,
Gretchen Buchenholz, who's a child advocate who's working today in New York, and really combines hands-on programs for homeless and other very poor children, job training for their parents, and also advocacy on major issues such as available treatment for HIV/AIDS, the appropriate screening for asthma. She's also been really active in terms of advocating for more actually cost-effective and humane models of housing for homeless families, and is quite effective in real
So these are all women who've really had a profound impact on social policy.
Yes.
And who are never, who've up until now not been written about that much or that much admired or understood. What did they have in common?
Well,
they had some things in common, but they did things. Some of them did it in a totally different way, right?
That's true. They differed in background and in style. I think one thing they had in common was that they didn't really covet credit and fame as much as they did just really helping people, really seeking out the most vulnerable, marginalized
human needs, basically.
Needs, and I think that that in a way that enabled them to be even more effective because they weren't focused on the credit and fame, and then it made them more willing to take unpopular stands if necessary.
And they were collaborative also, weren't they? That was something that struck me, is they worked with other people.
Mostly. I think that the two biggest exceptions I would say in the book would be Ida B. Wells and Mother Jones. Because they both had probably Mother Jones more than Ida B. Wells, but Ida B. Wells she had a lot of feuds and she had difficulty working with others. And it was something that bothered her. She wrote a lot about it in her diary, but she always said, "My temper is my besetting sin," and how she really wished that she could cultivate more female friendships. And Mother Jones, I think, was just a little bit over the top sometimes in terms of she was just out on her own, and she was more comfortable with men than with women, more comfortable kind of speaking to a crowd than working with others for a really appropriate strategic plan. But the others, I think, were all very collaborative, and I do think that it's interesting to look at that style.
And they were all organizers of sort.
Yes, right? Yes, absolutely, and ground up. Really, I think one thing that they had in common was just absolute respect for the people that they were representing and advocating for, so that there was no condescension. Alice Hamilton has a great quote where she worked with Jane Addams at Hull House, the great social reformer, and she was explaining how she had little patience with the social theorists who would come through there, and one of them was sort of walking with her through the slums and kind of shoving people aside while he was spouting on about, utopia, and she writes, well, I thought to myself, you love humanity, but you don't love your fellow man. And all of these women really did have great respect for those they're advocating for, and that really grounded their work.
Were many of them political? I'm trying to think of who wasn't political, but I think everybody was, weren't they?
Everyone was very much aware of and engaged in the political process, and very much sought to change the minds of the electorate and elected officials, and saw that kind of public policy difference would make
that strong advocacy. I mean, that's such an important thing, to make public officials several things: to educate them, and then to make them respond to you, right? And
Absolutely.
respond to the issues.
Yeah, I have a favorite story from one of the women about that, which to me really illustrates the political wheels turning, and that's Septima Clark in one of her citizenship schools. She had a young man who'd come through, and he was a very poor black farmer in South Carolina, and he decided to run for school board. And everybody, she said, well, we all knew he wouldn't win, but it was a great project for the class because it had extra incentive for people to register to vote. So he didn't win, but he garnered enough votes in the election that the next election cycle, there was a white judge who was up in a very tight race who came and sought, his name was Esau Jenkins out for his endorsement. And he said, well, I'll give it to you if you promise to change your attitude and policies towards blacks in the courtroom, which he did indeed promise, and then he won, and he did indeed do. And so to me, that's just such a exciting story about how the democratic process can work, be uplifting and accessible, and not just about that horse race, but about slow changes that really end up making a difference.
The other thing I think that you talked about was the questioning of the status quo or authority. That these were women who really would say, well, why is that happening, right? I mean, that's a very important thing, and you related it in a way to today.
Yes. Well, I was very inspired by the way in which they were not afraid to question the decisions of those in power at the time. And there are many great examples of that. Frances Perkins, when she was working for then Governor Roosevelt, President Hoover issued a report saying that unemployment wasn't so bad in the middle of the Great Depression, and she was so incensed by this and really made it her own mission to go and look at the statistics, and she had her own big press conference to say that he's just absolutely wrong about this and is not being straight with the American people. And FDR absolutely applauded her for it and ended up, obviously through many efforts of his own, though, being sought out as a major rising star in terms of being against the Hoover policies. And so it was really, that was one moment. And I think Alice Hamilton, she had studied in Germany, and after World War I, she was very much opposed to the Versailles Treaty and the blockade against Germany that was really exacerbating the instability as well as contributing to many thousands of starving children. She was totally chastised for speaking out, and she was, by her Harvard colleagues, said, you've got to stop going on these relief missions and arguing for an end to the blockade. You're embarrassing us. Harvard's donors are upset. And she, there's a great letter from her that says, I can't write to you what you wish to hear. And felt very strongly and explained it in strategic ways as well, warning early on actually about the rise of Hitler. So I love those stories.
So bring it to today. What would be a similar kind of thing? Al Gore talking against the invasion of Iraq?
Well, I did have that on my mind because I thought it was very eerie that people who raised a minority viewpoint about the invasion of Iraq were sort of shouted down and called unpatriotic. And to me, it was really interesting to look back and see how that had happened in the past. And I think what we're seeing now already is some regret that there wasn't a more robust discussion in the United States about how to proceed, not just whether to go to war, but how. Do we have enough money? Will there be more resistance? And there was such a mad rush, what Alice Hamilton called joyous ruthlessness, just a real need for an enemy right away. And even if they hadn't been the one that had attacked us on September 11th, and that was very much on my mind. And I think our country is never the better off for shouting down a minority viewpoint. And I wanted to celebrate dissent and
well,
the tolerance of dissent.
You did it very well.
Thank you.
If we go also, there was a wonderful sentence that the people at Harvard said to Alice Hamilton, the doctor, right? Mm-hmm. What was it about sentimentality and?
Oh, she said she felt a special calling to study the effects of chemicals on factory workers because qualified male scientists had rejected this field as tainted with socialism or with feminine sentimentality for the poor. And she had a very wry sense of humor and a very sort of tolerant way about her. She understood this, and she, rather than be angry about it, she really, what she did was take away that taint, because by the end of her career, it was very much on the agenda of the President Roosevelt to have workers' compensation, to have some semblance of public health.
So when you look at the people who've been the most vocal about the war in Iraq, and we look, and I mean, our political leaders have not been very upfront about it, and you look at the women, and the women are looking at it again from the human needs, the killing of the civilians in Iraq and the killing of the young men and women that we send over to this war, and then the subsequent impact of the cost of the thing on the different social kinds of needs that we have. It's always an interesting parallel, isn't it?
Well, I think it's important that people feel confident to challenge whatever the status quo is, but and particularly at a time when you have all branches of the government in the hands of one party. I think it's important that people, and women in particular, who have historically not been encouraged to speak out. I think it's important to feel bold enough to do so.
And women have a very specific perspective that I think brings it down to a very human level, right?
Well, I think it's true that most women are still, that women are mostly the primary caregivers of children. That is a huge thing in terms of your perspective. And most of the women in Lighting the Way were teachers or in the medical profession, two sort of more helping professions that were open to women in much of the last century. And I think that also gives that perspective of empathy, of understanding what that human need is to feed a child, to educate a youth,
house and everything,
and take care of an elderly person. Also, still the primary responsibility of women. And so I do think it does give a different perspective.
As a grandmother who's always hoping that I could pass some wisdom down to my grandchildren, I was particularly struck in the beginning of your book when you talk about the role of your grandmother Gore and how you admired her and how she was, in fact, a very political, effective person.
Absolutely, and she was a big role model to me. She herself, born in a relatively poor family in West Tennessee, and resolved early on to be a lawyer, and she worked her way up waiting tables and taking in boarders with her mother at home, and became one of the first women to graduate from Vanderbilt Law School in 1936. But she had a lot of trouble finding work because they said that you would be taking the job away from a man who's the head of a household. So she couldn't get a work in a Nashville law firm. She did eventually practice briefly in Texarkana, but she really was a partner to my grandfather and his political career, which spanned...
And you give her credit for some of the significant votes that he did make, right?
Yeah, she very much encouraged him to take some bold stands in those tumultuous times, 1938 to 1970. And actually, our families, do we have to move on?
I have to say goodbye.
Okay, well, this was just so much fun. I feel like we could talk all day.
And I'm very happy to see that you have an impact also in your family, and I'm sure your mother does too, and I really appreciate it, and the book is wonderful, and thank you very much.
Thank you. This was such a pleasure.
Thank you. If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv